Hey, Church History, this is Jared Patrick. Church History 2, that is. Second part. I am Jared. I'm reviewing Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Cost of Discipleship, or the book that we were given, just Discipleship. It's the same book, just retitled, and it's got a different preference. I read Cost of Discipleship about 4 years ago, and this was me, or the book that I got through Midwestern was a different edition, same thing. Um, it is a tremendous book. So from the very beginning, we have to understand it's a book on discipleship, ultimately obedience to Christ and a call for obedience. In fact, Bonhoeffer's main quote that he's known for in this book is when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. And so it is a relentless book when it comes to just sheer obedience to Christ, particularly found in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, even up through Matthew 10. So that's part of Bonhoeffer's story as well. But just a couple of things about Bonhoeffer. The first time I read Cost of Discipleship, I didn't know much about Bonhoeffer, but he is fascinating. Looking at Eric Metaxas's book called Bonhoeffer, so helpful. But Bonhoeffer is an interesting guy. Born in Germany, February 4th, 1906. He was a twin, actually, and he had a twin sister, born, I think, to 8 kids. He and his sister were 6 and 7 or something like that. He died in April 9th, 1945. And it's sort of controversial depending on who you're reading, but some would call him a martyr for the faith, being that he was very much against the Nazi regime, against Adolf Hitler for most of his time. Even one of the founding members of Confessing Church, which is in opposition really of the government-sponsored efforts to unify all Protestant churches in Nazi Germany. He was completely outspoken against it, getting himself into trouble not only among the Nazi Party, but as he went to London for a stint, even among evangelical leaders, he got into a lot of trouble. But that's not really my purpose, is to talk about Bonhoeffer. But it was I want to learn more about him. That mainly people saying, which I can get to in a minute. When you look at the book, though, it's really broken into 4 main movements. As I read the book again for the second time, really the first and the fourth, I think it is a great reminder to us, and quite honestly, the first movement is what he's known for. So the 4 movements are kind of as follows: the foundations of discipleship. Really, the first, I think, 4 or 5 chapters, he's talking about the foundation of discipleship. Where he gets or where he's famous is this idea of cheap grace versus costly grace. Then he'll go into unpacking the Sermon on the Mount, and to be honest, he does a good job. It's very, as you read how he unpacks rather Matthew 5, 6, 7, he does a good job. It's very, so as I read it, it's just very simple. In fact, even in our church, we'll be preaching Sermon on the Mount at the beginning of the fall, and so it was just helpful for me to read through it. He'll unpack the Sermon on the Mount as part of the second part of the book. The third part, he gets into evangelism, and I think he does a good job there too. I say the second and the third part are good. The first and the last are awesome. So he starts with the foundations of discipleship, cheap grace versus costly grace. Second movement really is unpacking the Sermon on the Mount. Third part is evangelism. And the fourth part is the local church. And he does a tremendous job when it comes to walking through the local church and how the local church is an absolute necessity when it comes to our discipleship. So let me talk to you a little bit about all 4 of them. First, the foundations of discipleship. He talks through costly grace versus cheap grace. And I want to give you some quotes really that he's known for and are very, very helpful. Here's what he says about cheap grace and costly grace. This is helpful. He says, cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. Now, just a little bit of study. Last little study on repentance. Just knowing that cheap grace would be preaching forgiveness without requiring repentance, meaning turning from sin, turning to Christ. Even today, um, I'm I'm careful even, or I don't oftentimes see forgiveness and repentance tied together in that. So it's obvious to me that cheap grace is preached, sadly. Repentance, turning from something, turning from sin, turning to something more glorious. So it's a transfer of love. It's I love this sin, but I love turning to a greater love, which would be Christ's love. He goes on, baptism without church discipline, communion without confession, absolution without personal confession. He says cheap grace is grace without discipleship. Discipleship is hard. Sanctification is hard. Grace without the cross, that's tough. Grace without Jesus Christ, living and incarnate. He then goes on to talk about costly grace, which is what he bases the whole book on, or his writings. Costly grace is the hidden, or the treasure hidden in the field. For the sake of it, a man will go and sell all that he has. It's complete abandonment. It is the pearl of great price to buy which the merchant will sell all his goods. It is the kingly rule of Christ for those for whose sake a man will pluck out the eye which causes him to stumble. It is the call of Jesus Christ at which the disciple leaves his nets and follows him. I was reminded just the seriousness in which he talks about sin when it comes to costly grace, of what it actually cost. I was reminded of even an interview with John Piper, and a pastor said, I have this guy coming in consistently who just says, I can't stop sinning related to pornography. And I was reminded of Bonhoeffer by Piper's reaction. He said, have you considered telling him to pluck out his eye? As a indication or a thought of, this is very serious. This is not something to be trifled with, as even John Owen would say, be killing sin or it will be killing you. The mortification, there is that is the weight of costly grace, that it was costly. And not only was it costly for God to send his son, it's costly for us. It cost us something. He goes into simple obedience. He goes into discipleship in the cross. Again, that's when you find that quote of, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. Now, for me, that first section is incredible for us as a nation, as a culture, as a time in history, because Christianity so oftentimes is sold as a health and wealth prosperity type of gospel, which is permeating so much of our church. And Bonhoeffer's manifesto here really is, no, this is a call to come and die. And even as you consider Paul in that of, for me to live is Christ, for me to die is gain. I was reminded often in cheap grace versus costly grace of the importance of that, for us to remember that, the cost of not only what it cost Christ, but also for us. So from that point, that was just so helpful for me. Moving into unpacking the Sermon on the Mount, again, I say that he does just a good job here. I think he does a good job. He does something that's interesting for me, and I know that many will argue for or against, but he says something in this part that's just interesting when it comes to Beatitudes. He says, bless them that persecute you. Here's his quote. If our enemy cannot put up with us any longer and takes to cursing us, our immediate reaction must be to lift up our hands and to bless him. Our enemies are the blessed of the Lord. Their curse can do us no harm. May their poverty be enriched with all the riches of God, with the blessing of him who they seek to oppose in vain. We are ready to endure their curses so long as they redound to their blessing. So what's just interesting to me is, allegedly he was in the plot to assassinate Hitler, and so That's sort of the or that's the what we see, or what many people argue of. So he was talking a lot about bless those who persecute you. However, he was in a now the other side goes to, well, it was a righteous anger. I just find it interesting. He goes through the Sermon on the Mount. I did not give that justice. I get it, but again, I think we only have 6 minutes. I'm already 11 minutes in. He goes on to the third movement in the book, which is evangelism, and I think this was a good one. It was a sobering reminder to me. I have some. I don't have issue with it. I just as I read it, it was a sobering reminder to me. But Bonhoeffer warns us not to fear man. That was a large part of his evangelism section. He says, "Those who are still afraid of men have no fear of God, and those who have fear of God have ceased to be afraid of men," referring to our approach in evangelism. He tells us that we will face suffering, and that we will be hated to the end of time. But then he takes that and it moves. He says, "However, the harvest is plentiful and the workers are few." He said, "Therefore beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest." So in some ways it's encouraging to not fear man. Just as reading that, it was just a good reminder. It's a sobering reminder of not fearing man, not to be so worried about what people think about you as you step into evangelism. Although I did just sense of the issue of hospitality and bringing people in, and I know that Bonhoeffer did that, obviously. It just had a weight to it when it comes to evangelism. Fourth movement would be the local church. It is interesting that Bonhoeffer assumes that the local church is the center of our discipleship. Here's what my pastor said. He cannot think of sanctification in purely personal terms, but only in the context of the church. He talked a lot about that it is impossible for us to grow in our discipleship without the local church. And so this too, not only do I see in our culture a cheapening of grace, rather than viewing costly grace, I see a cheapening of the local church as well, whether it be in membership, a raising the bar of membership to where we actually know that our members are saved, are regenerate. I see that Bonhoeffer, he's in the last part of his book, he has such a high value on the local church, which I think is so helpful. He then the foundation of church discipline is found in this part of the book. He talked about church discipline. He says the church must have a sufficient authority to bring formal disciplinary action against a brother who falls into open sin in word and deed. As I just considered that of just the importance of the local church, of a covenant group of people together, living out in community. I love that Bonhoeffer was so committed to biblical community before the small group movement went whatever. In these four sections, the four movements, the foundation of discipleship was so helpful. Costly grace versus cheap grace. Unpacking of the Sermon on the Mount, which goes, 5, 6, 7 of Matthew, then getting to evangelism, the local church, going all the way through Matthew 10. Bonhoeffer does a great job. This book is a tremendous book. It absolutely should be in every library of every Christian or ministry leader. And I'm grateful. There's a few books that I've now been able. I'm still young, but a few books that I've been able to go back and read, and it's awesome just to see what you didn't see when you were younger. In my case, 4 or 5 years. I am just starting to see our culture drift towards cheap grace, and I know that there's nothing new under the sun. And it's not great, but it's interesting to see back to Bonhoeffer and how he handled it. I'm grateful for this man, grateful for this book. I would highly encourage everyone to read it. Anyway, hope all y'all are doing well. It's been a great semester for those of you who've been on here for Church 1 and Church 2, but I'm grateful. And anyway, hope you all have a great night.